Hello, this is Robert Rickover at Body Learning, and today my guest is Constance Claire Newman, an Alexander Technique teacher in the San Francisco Bay Area. Her website is constanceclaire.com. We'll put a link to it next to the interview. Welcome to the show, Constance.
Hi, thank you.
And we're going to talk today about sexuality and the Alexander Technique. And I'd like to begin with just a little bit about how you came to the Alexander Technique in the first place, and then how you became interested in the connection with sexuality.
Great. Okay. Like many people, I came to the Alexander Technique as a performer and as someone in pain. I had our chronic lower back problems, sciatica, and diagnosed with various things. And I was still young and still determined, and I would just kind of push through the pain and go to many dance classes and many rehearsals and just to do as much as I can with dealing with the pain as little as possible. I joined Anne Bleethenthal and Dancers, which is now a 25-year company. Anne Bleethenthal is the artistic director, and she's an Alexander Technique teacher also here in the Bay Area. And her choreography, I think, is influenced quite a lot by the ideas of Alexander. So dancing for her, and coming from a ballet background, I had certain patterns and habits that were particular to ballet and perhaps not the greatest training in ballet. And I had difficulty expressing her choreography, her modern and much freer, open, and less held choreography. So she suggested that I take lessons, and I did. I actually took lessons with another Alexander Technique teacher so as to keep the dance and the Alexander relationships separate. And during this time, I learned that I could really change the way that I moved in my dance by thinking very specifically, as we do in our lessons. And I also got tools for dealing with the pain. So during with this time, I also realized that the way that I was being in the world, which was very what we call type A, very rushing around and very kind of pushing through everything and always fighting with myself somehow to get things right and do it right. And also, as a dancer, having many different part-time jobs, and I was going to school at the same time, and I was feeling very stressed pretty much all of the time. That was just my norm. So very stressed, still dealing with some amount of pain, and using my new way of moving in dance. So when I finished a BA in literature, I decided I really wanted to stay in movement, that was my that was how I could imagine being in the world and working. So I went into the Alexander training.
And that's training to become a teacher of the Alexander
Training to
Technique.
become a teacher, yes, yes. And I did my training with Frank Ottewell in San Francisco. And during those 3 years, my day job was working at Good Vibrations. Good Vibrations is a sort of clean, well-lighted sex toy and sex book and sex video store. It was started in the 70s by a feminist, Joni Blank, and she had the idea that she would have a store that was for all women who didn't want to necessarily go to some of the adult stores that were available then. And her whole philosophy was that she wanted women to feel comfortable, and she wanted women to get accurate information about sexuality. And she wanted women to not feel judged or shamed or pressured in any way. So the way that Good Vibrations runs is that all the staff are go through a training, a sex education training, and so as the book buyer, I not only had a sex education training, but I also had many, many opportunities to read very much about all different kinds of sexuality and some, very inaccurate and sort of dreadful, and some wonderful. And so, um, as the person who was making that decision, what we would carry, I learned a lot in the 3 years, perhaps more than I even wanted to. No,
Right.
I liked the learning process. Some of the erotica at that time, we were very politically correct as well. So we chose erotica that we felt was kind of happy and wholesome and and generative of good in the world, rather than anything that might be shaming or racist or misogynist. Um, and now I think it has shifted a little bit. I don't work for Good Vibrations anymore, but I would say in the world of erotica, there has been a shift in that people understand that sometimes fantasies can be some of those nasty bad things, and that doesn't mean the person is going to
Hmm.
be.
Hmm.
So there's a shift in, I think, how people see erotica these days.
Hmm.
So, and the other reason that I come to sexuality and sex education is my partner is the owner of Cleus Press, and Cleus Press has been publishing sex books and erotica and guides, sexuality guides, very good, very accurate ones for also 25 years. So I have a lot of conversations with her about this, and she's also the author of the whole lesbian sex book. So there's a lot of discussion in our house, very freely and very open and easy. Also, Felice is a somatic coach who works with people and couples around sexuality.
Hmm.
So our house is a very open kind of place about sex.
Right. And so, when did you start making the connection between what you'd learned with the Alexander technique and sexuality?
I think that was in my training. I
Hmm.
don't think that I made the connection before, although I might have just here a little bit here and there. But in your Alexander training, it's a 3 year course, and really every part of your life, all of the habits and patterns that and behaviors and thoughts and every part of our character really is explored. And at least in our training, it was. And I think that we even had discussions about how our use of our whole being was changing and how that impacted our sexuality. I know that we had discussions how it might possibly impact an affair with an Alexander teacher. And although I've never actually had sex with an Alexander teacher, um, I've certainly thought about how it might be different in the kind of quality of being that that we are mm, working towards embodying.
Right, right. Well, if I could just interject for a second here.
Yeah.
I trained in London in the late 70s, and we never talked about sex in the Alexander
No.
technique in the training course. But it did happen one day, kind of by accident, that the three, or maybe there were four male members of my class happened to be having tea together after class one day, and the subject came up, and we all agreed that that was one of the most profound influences, and yet it had never. And we'd all had pretty similar experiences, and
Really?
yeah, and we were all amazed to discover that we all had the same, um, had benefited in that area in the same way, but yet it had never come up in classes. Sort of
Right.
ironic, but that was London in the 30 years ago, and when you were training, that was San Francisco, what, 15 years ago?
Yes, yes.
There's a world of difference. But
Yes.
anyway, so I think it might be good at this point for you to for someone who's intrigued by this connection to say a little more specifically how Alexander technique lessons uh, could actually help someone enhance their sexuality and their sex lives.
Yes. So I think most of us then, including your experience in London, um, are experiencing the benefits or the greater pleasure indirectly. So as we change our use of ourself from lessons, we become less tense, less held. We become more aware of sensations through the whole self. And so as we are each individually on our own Alexander journey, really, um, we might become aware of these sort of undoings or allowings or new sensations during sex.
And just to
And
interrupt for a second, that phrase you used, the use of ourselves, that might not make too much sense to someone who's not in the Alexander world. Could you just say a sentence or two about what you mean by that?
yes, the use of ourselves is how we go about uh, all of our daily activities, how we use our bodies and the connection with the body and the mind in our life. So the self is not just the body, the self is not just the mind, the self is the whole integrated organism, so to speak.
And it might be useful to say here that this concept of use, spelled USE, that Alexander came up with was a pretty interesting idea that hadn't really been thought about before. In that he came to realize, and I think anyone who has any Alexander technique experience comes to realize that there are certain patterns of posture and movement that we tend to carry over into a huge range of activities.
Right.
So it's not about how you do a particular activity, but how you do everything. And I think one of Alexander, this is the guy who developed the Alexander technique, F. Matthias Alexander, I think one of his big discoveries really was that there's a commonality that cuts across various activities.
That's right.
Anyway, I
That's
just wanted to clarify that for our audience. Anyway,
wonderful.
yeah,
Yes, we have a little bit of jargon, just like uh,
the
many
Alexander
fields.
the
Yeah,
Alexander technique does have a bit of jargon, not a whole lot, but some, and it's pretty important to explain. I think those terminology to people.
that's right.
Anyway,
That's right.
so you were saying,
So I would say that that indirectly, many students of the Alexander technique um, would come to these kind of thoughts or explorations by themselves without any um, direct communication about it with their teacher or their training course, or unless they were so like you said, like friends or like trainees in a course.
so I think we should get back to or get on to the topic really of how specifically lessons in the Alexander technique would help someone with sexuality.
Yes, and I think that there is a overall change of one's use of the self
Hmm.
that that influences every area of one's life, including sexuality. And in my experience with my students, uh, I would say, in general, whatever changes they're experiencing, they don't come to me about sex. Occasionally, I have had students speak to me about their experiences, And it's always been really delightful, delightful and positive conversation. Um, and it's never been very specific. So that is, I've never had a student come to me and say, well, hey, Constance, while I was having an orgasm last night, what I really noticed was that I wasn't tensing, my thighs as much, and therefore da 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 da. So,
Hmm.
but they would bring it up in the context of how great their relationship was going, or something like that. So, however, as a sex educator and as someone who feels relatively easy talking about sex, I think that they might bring it up more with me, and especially if they know that part of my life. Um, and then because I'm easy to talk to about it, perhaps I have more conversations than the average Alexander Technique teacher would with their student about sex.
Hmm.
I would never bring it up myself as a topic to work with in lessons. I would always wait for the student to broach that subject.
Hmm.
Um, that said, if somebody is broaching the subject, I will talk about the different ways that the Alexander Technique and the work that we're doing in changing the use of ourself, or refining, getting getting an easier relationship to one's own body, to one's own emotional self, to the world, really, and of course to one's partners, or relationships, all relationships, really. Um, so one of the ways that I see that happening, aside from this very indirect kind of ease that we are going toward, is in the specific concept of tension and contraction that we humans do whenever there's something that startles us, or whenever we have anxiety or fear. And it's also a an instinctive response as we're coming toward orgasm. So the contractions, which create an orgasm, one can have one can tighten one's whole body, and sort of very um, as tight, and tight and contracted, and that kind of sometimes helps, or creates an orgasm, perhaps faster, or more, or something, is people's experience. But it's very interesting to explore the opposite. So to explore an undoing. So as one is coming towards arousal, and going through the whole process, um, one consciously undoes those, um, the tightness of the whole body. Not that you don't want to eventually have those contractions that are the delightful orgasm itself, but
Hmm.
that as you're going towards that, there's a possibility of being uh, more sensate, that is, experiencing the sensations really throughout the body, um, as the as you are releasing, and not contracting as much. So tight muscles don't feel right, but
Hmm.
freer muscles, and freer muscles have somehow the sensation, the skin, the touch, um, the quality of sensation is more when the muscles are freer.
And that ability to release some of the contraction consciously,
Yes.
that's something that someone who takes Alexander lessons would be probably a lot better able to do than
Yes.
without the lessons. And
Well, that is one of the things that we are learning in lessons, is a conscious undoing of tension. And
right,
usually we're starting with the head neck and the balance of the head neck.
right,
And often we go towards to breath, and then we are thinking about it, this releasing throughout the entire body, and we're applying it in different activities. So as I play my violin, I think about releasing through my arms, right?
right.
As well as other places, of course. But we are getting very specific about how each of us can come to this undoing of tension and contraction in our various the things that we do in our life.
And that's going to be different than someone just saying to themselves, "I'd like to be a little more relaxed."
Definitely.
And because it because in fact, you in a way, I guess you could say, you need a kind of a specific methodology to do that effectively.
Yes, and I think that the grounding of this idea where we begin with the head neck relationship, the joint at the head neck, not contracting down, not compressing the head. It's sort of this 101. This is the beginning where we start, but we might go to the ankles being free and then to the breath being free, and then there's one is encompassing the whole self and including the habits or the reaction, the emotional reactions as well. So as we in Alexander lessons become more skilled at undoing and releasing, I think that kind of overflows to different areas. But it's definitely a skill, this awareness, and I often use the term proprioception in lessons, the sense within. So it's not just the kinesthetic sense, how we are moving around in space, but what's going on internally and how you can actually influence with your intention the internal sensations and changes.
And that ability to use your intention in an effective way, that is exactly what Alexander teachers teach people to do.
That's the crux of what we do. Yes.
Of the technique. Now, it seems to me that another way in which there might be a connection is, let's take someone who comes to lessons because they have back pain, which is a pretty common reason actually for people
Certainly
taking
is.
lessons. Now, if you have back pain, that is going to very likely interfere with your sexuality, just in terms of the mechanics, right?
Definitely, yeah.
So that's a whole nother. I mean, it's related to what you were talking about before, or indeed, if you have any kind of physical pain, that's not likely to help out with your sexuality.
Right. So, in the way that we will sometimes look at, or often look at the biomechanics of movement that somebody might do in their daily life, as well as the very basic movements of standing and sitting and walking and bending. The way that we look at that in lessons is applicable to sex as well. So there's so many kind of creative ways that one might explore having sex with somebody that is not necessarily our traditional model. So I think the more that one understands as you take lessons how the biomechanics, how the body works most efficiently, the more kind of options open up as far as how you might explore that in the bedroom or in the living room or the kitchen.
Right. Or on the beach.
Exactly.
Are there other things that you'd like to say on this topic, or other connections between the technique and sexuality that you'd like to bring out?
Well, I think that one of the big things that I consider, we talked about contraction and releasing, which is kind of, I would say, sort of the 101 of talking about Alexander and sex. But there's a sort of larger concept in there, or an umbrella concept perhaps, of presence. And my my own sense of no matter how one is having sex, like let's say you're just going to have a quickie in the kitchen. You don't want to be lying around, breathing and having sensations for hours. Just gonna um it's the kind of quality of presence that that the two lovers bring to the situation. So instead of being like, even in that situation in the kitchen, you're going to have a quickie. It's a little bit goal oriented, right? Um, there's a way that being really sensing the whole self and being connected with self while connected with partner is something that you're developing as an Alexander student in all the areas of your life. So that's the area I think to me that makes lovemaking or sex kind of um, better. It's the quality that both partners are bringing um, that is a, a state of being really awake to what's happening with me and what's happening with you, right? The
Hmm.
state of really like listening and also receiving. So there's a give and take and a receiving and a that shifts somehow with the intention. If you have that intention to be um, in that state with somebody, and I think that often we start to think about performance so much that we lose that state. And this is what I hear from, you know, um, just people in general, not so much my students, but this is what I've heard a lot in the Alexander training too. Like the idea that instead of being tense about, well, am I pleasing her? Am I doing it the right way? And is she da da da, da, rather just letting that presence mm, organically influence what's happening.
So, what you've just been talking about seems to me somewhat analogous to reasons why musicians and actors and dancers often study the technique. At least one of the reasons is to have that sense of presence with themselves and with their audience, so they're open to feedback and open to a connection between themselves and the audience. Do you see that analogy in sexuality as well?
Oh, definitely. I would say that if you can if you can create that state of being, if you can intend that state of being and you have the skills to get there, um, there is a spontaneity that and an aliveness that opens up and it is exactly the same as in a performance or in anything in in life. And I think that the analogy between the performer being with self and with audience and also with the greater environment, and of course the performer has his lines and his blocking and all this other stuff. um, it's the same in sex, right? You want to be with yourself and with your partner, and you also have whatever ideas you have that you're exploring and techniques that you might want to try. Or so there's it's really one of the things that we say in the Alexander technique is an expanded field of intention, an expanded field of attention that can include more than is typical for us. So I think that's exactly what we're talking about with performance and with this idea about being embodied in a fuller way, really, with sexuality.
Well, I think unless there's something else you want to add, this might be a good place to end our interview.
Okay, that
Uh,
sounds good to me.
all right. I've been speaking today with Constance Claire Newman, an Alexander Technique teacher in the San Francisco Bay Area. And her website is constanceclaire.com. Certainly, if you're in the Bay Area and what we've been talking about intrigues you, give her a call. And if you're somewhere else, see if you could find an Alexander Technique teacher and have some lessons yourself. So, Constance, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you so much, Robert.